microphone that I wear when I do these is very sensitive to leaf blowers. And even though it didn't sound very loud when we were in here recording, it sounded really loud when it came over the microphone. So that's what happened last week. But we're back this week a little bit more technologically savvy and ready to go. Happy Memorial Day. As you all know, today is Memorial Day. And in our society, Memorial Day has almost become a time for celebrating the beginning of summer. There's parades, you go to the beach, there's cookouts, there's picnics, all the things we really enjoy doing. And I just want all of us to take just a little moment and remember what Memorial Day really symbolizes. Memorial Day is meant to remember the men and women of the armed services who died in the service of our country. Now, for those of you who know me, you know that I'm a retired Navy captain. I spent 28 years on active duty. Today is not for me. Today is to remember those people who have died. Now, when a country hires mercenaries to fight their battles for them, you don't see any memorials. You don't see any special days or celebrations or parade to remember mercenaries, because they're just doing it for the money. But you see the young men and women from our country who've given their lives for our country, and we have all those things. And the question is, why? And it really relates to the series that we're going through when we're talking about being. We're talking about being and doing. All those young men and women gave their lives because they loved their country. And I'm not talking about loving our government or loving the buildings. I'm talking about loving the people. They love their families, they love their friends, they love their fellow citizens enough to place their freedom and their safety above their own and be willing to sacrifice their lives in order to preserve that and to protect them. And that's what we honor this Memorial Day. I think when we talk about being and doing, we can never completely separate those, because what we do, and we're always doing things, what we do comes from who we are, our very being. So when you think about being, I think it's useful to take a look at God's being to begin with. And when God encountered Moses at the burning bush and told him to go to the elders of Israel, Moses said, well, what should I tell them when they ask me, what's your name? Who sent you? And God replied and said, tell them, I am who I am. And translated, that means to be. So when we look at God's being, it implies several different things. It implies that he's self-existent, that he doesn't need us, that he's not dependent upon us or upon anyone else for his existence, that he's the creator and the sustainer of all things in the entire universe, that he's unchangeable in his being and his character. He's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He's eternal in his existence. He's always existed, and he always will exist. And the translation can also be, I will be, which really speaks to the promises that he makes to his people, that he will fulfill all of his promises. So obviously, we're not God, and our being is different than God's being. So what does that mean? What does that mean to us? What does that mean about our being? And I really like what Jeremy said 2 weeks ago. The Beatitudes really lay out Jesus' character. So let's review that quickly. So the Beatitudes say that blessed are those who are poor in spirit, which Lee talked about yesterday. If you didn't watch that yesterday, I would encourage you to. Lee did a wonderful job talking about being poor in spirit and what that means. Blessed are those who mourn, who are meek, who hunger and thirst for righteousness, who are merciful, who are pure in heart, who are peacemakers, who are persecuted. Thinking through this and wrestling with this brought me to something that John Piper said. He says, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And being satisfied in God means being in relationship with him, not in the things that we do, but in our relationship with him. So what does it mean to be satisfied in God? And I came up with a few things: to be content, to be secure, and to be happy. If we look for contentment in things of this world, we'll always be disappointed. A few months ago, Jeremy in a sermon talked about the driving forces behind society: pride, power, and profit, the 3 Ps. all those things will leave us empty. I remember several years ago reading an interview from a Wall Street trader who'd been engaged in inside trading, and he got caught and he got sent to jail. And when he was doing this, he was making tens of millions of dollars a year, more money than he could ever spend. And when he was asked what gave him satisfaction, what gave him the drive to do this, the only thing that he came up with is making more money than he had the year before. No matter how much money he made, it wasn't enough unless he made more than he'd made the year before. We can talk about security and looking for security in the things of this world. Well, we know that things in this world are constantly changing. Governments rise and fall. Businesses rise and fall. Look where we were 4 months ago. The economy was humming along. It was growing. The stock market was going through the roof. Our retirement accounts looked great. Unemployment was at historic lows. And then all of a sudden, this global pandemic comes along. There's no security to be found in the things of this world. They're constantly changing. And then we talk about happiness. We talk about relationship with God. And really, our greatest possible happiness comes from our relationship with God, in knowing Him, not in knowing things about Him, not in knowing things about His creation, but in actually knowing Him. You know, we can study theology and know a lot about God. A few years ago, I read about the theology department at Princeton. And Princeton, as you all know, is a phenomenal university, incredibly brilliant people there. If you've never been there, the campus is just absolutely drop dead gorgeous. So it's a really, really well-respected school from an academic standpoint. But in their department of systematic theology, 4 of the 6 professors were atheists. So for them, the study of God, the study of theology, was just a study of facts, of ways that this book, which they didn't actually believe, had affected society throughout history. So without the relationship with Christ, theology was just dry academic study. You know, we can study science and learn all kinds of things about God's creation, about the magnificence of God's creation. But without that relationship with God, we come to the conclusion that our existence is really just a meaningless accident of the universe, instead of the purposeful, significant existence that God has planned for us. So without Christ, that relationship is really devoid of joy. So I wanted to find a picture that depicted joy in relationship. And I looked around the internet for a while, and then I realized that I had the picture that I wanted right on my phone. So I wanted to go ahead and take a look at this picture. This is my wife, Debbie, and this is our grandson, Everett. Debbie watches Everett sometimes while Miranda works, so Debbie has developed a very close relationship with Everett like she has with all of our grandchildren. But you look at this and you see just the absolute joy in a relationship between those two. Just look at the expression on Debbie's face. Now, there's a lot of unpleasant things that you need to do for a baby. Changing diapers, and there's spit up, and there's crying, and there's times when they're inconsolable. And if you don't have a loving relationship, those things are burdensome. Those things aren't any fun. But with the way that Debbie loves that little boy, those things are joy. Just like they are for all of us who love our children and our grandchildren. We do things for them because we love things and because they bring us joy. And that's how our relationship with God should be. If we're just fulfilling a bunch of rules and regulations, it's dry and it's joyless. When I went through officer indoctrination school up in Newport, Rhode Island, we had to do a lot of things to follow a lot of rules. In the morning, you had to make sure all of your books on your desk were lined up from tallest to the shortest and pushed all the way back against the wall, because they'd come in and inspect and push them back, and if they moved, that was a demerit. You had to slide underneath your bed and pull the bed sheets really tight and tuck them into the springs so that your bed would be tight and they could bounce a quarter off your bed. Now, none of that brought me any joy. I did those things because I was aware of what the consequences were if I didn't. Our relationship with God should be completely different. It should be like that relationship with Debbie and with Everett. The things that we do for God should be joyful. The things that we do should emanate from our loving relationship with God. I want to read for you a passage from Philippians by Paul. Now, this passage was probably written when he was imprisoned in Rome. We're not entirely sure, but Philippi was the first church that Paul had founded in Europe. And you remember a lot of different story from this church. His relationship with Lydia, one of his first converts there. The fact that Paul and Silas were both imprisoned in Philippi because they'd driven the demon out of the slave girl who told fortunes and brought profit to her masters. About Paul and Silas's release from jail and the conversion of the Philippian jailer and his family. These were people that Paul knew. These were people with whom he had a relationship. And at its essence, Philippians is really a book about joy in our relationship with God, joy in our relationship with Christ. So I'm going to read verses in chapter 3. I'm going to read verses 4 to 8, and then part of verse 10. And it's talking initially about people who take pride in the flesh, pride in the things of this world. And he starts and says, though I myself have reason for confidence in the flesh also. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews. As to the law, a Pharisee. As to zeal, a persecutor of the church. As to righteousness under the law, blameless. So here Paul was saying, look at me. I have everything that the world desires, that the world looks up to. I have the right family lineage. I have the right education. I'm advancing ahead of people of my own rank as far as my education. I'm respected. I'm looked up to. From the standpoint of Jewish society, Paul was it. Paul had it all. And notice he says, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. He followed all the rules. But then he goes on to say, but whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ. Indeed, I count everything as loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. For his sake, I have suffered the loss of all things and count them as rubbish, in order that I may gain Christ, that I may know him. Paul was willing to give up all those things that he had, everything that society valued, joyfully because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ. So much so that later in Philippians 4, Paul can say that he's learned the secret of being content in all circumstances. And that secret of contentment is that relationship with Christ. When we talk about our being, it's not divorced from the things we do. We will always do things, but we're going to do things for a reason. When we talk about our being and who we are and our character, that's what determines the worth and the value, ultimately, of the things that we do. So Christ is our rock, a rock on whom we can build our lives, our existence, and our being. I'm very excited about this current series on the Beatitudes, to work through these different areas every week. As I said before, if you haven't watched Lee's sermon from yesterday, please watch it.